It's good to be with you on a very special paid edition of Narrative Live. We're doing something really different tonight. For several months, I've been telling you about the investigation called The Greatest Heist. We've been looking at how Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein became part of the same network that ultimately could have led, I believe did lead, to the largest criminal conspiracy in modern history. And this evening, I'm welcoming investigative journalist Patrick Lovell, who you also know as a producer and documentarian and did The Con, which is a great series, which we'll talk about later on. And Patrick is here to basically walk us through the first 10 chapters of The Greatest Heist. I've done the first 10, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today as well. We've got your chats up here, so we'll definitely answer your questions as they happen.
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for the honor to be able to discuss this with you. I'm new to Zev, and I cannot believe that I just discovered Zev just recently. Because what happened was in this crazy universe of social media and just how things happen and interact, I just happened to come into contact with the gentleman and his colleague and friend, Lev Parnas. And I started watching more of Lev's stuff, particularly on Substack. And suddenly I discovered Zev. And I was like, who is this guy? And the next thing I know, because I'm an investigative journalist and I've been a producer for decades, I started to look into who he is and what he does and how he frames his stuff. And one of the first things I came into contact with after I had discovered your wonderful colleagues, Olga and Dean, and I became a big fan of the Five Stack. In
Hey,
fact, I
Dean's
don't.
online tonight as well. Hey, Dean, how are you? And Nick.
Hi,
Hey, Nick.
Dean.
Hey, everybody.
I'm a
Big
big
crowd.
fan. And I can't live without the Five Stack, by the way. And so I have
It's
that as part of
essential.
my
It's
day.
essential viewing.
Yes, absolutely. And just a quick background on me. I've been an investigative journalist now for about 14 years. And prior to that, I mean, when we go back in the Wayback Machine, I studied journalism and political science in college. And I've always been in the mix of activism. And, one thing led to another. And my path led me into Hollywood as a producer. And so I had worked at Warner Brothers and Paramount Pictures. I have a funny side story, if we can get to it later, about what I think may have been President Clinton on the island, quite frankly. But
Oh,
that's another story. After the 2008 great financial crisis, I was sort of forced into learning a lot more about the world than I had ever anticipated. And in doing so, I became a journalist. That's no easy task because journalism is hard work. Journalism creates, just endless amounts of being able to cross your T's and dot your I's and get the evidence and understand how you put stories together. Otherwise, you're going to be vulnerable and you're going to get it wrong and you're going to lose your trust and your credibility and everything. And as time started to propel forward, I started to discover that most of media was in a death spiral because it certainly wasn't adding up into the world that I was actually living in. And so as my journey started to unfold, I went on literally a 13-year odyssey, of which I'm nearing the end of, which led me on my own path to what I thought was the greatest heist in history. And so when I saw Zev make that bold proclamation, I thought to myself, come on, who's this guy and what does he know? Next thing I know, I found myself drawn into his narrative Substack page and I discovered The Greatest Heist. And when I started to read it, I couldn't stop. I felt like I was I don't know, like a teenager reading some of my favorite, CIA or intelligence books by authors like Robert Ludlum, which was, of course, The Bourne Identity, and then, of course, Tom Clancy. And I grew up with those sorts of books, and I understood the whole scenario. But when I started to discover your stories, I couldn't believe what I was reading. First and foremost, it started to, I would say, fit the pieces of the puzzle of questions that I had into my story. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, why hasn't somebody done this before? Which was a stupid question because it's the truth.
mhm.
Nobody wants to do a story of global racketeering at the highest levels involving some of the most salacious things that anybody could ever possibly imagine because that's not good for business. I discovered that the hard way. And
Me
of
too.
course, this has brought us together. And
Yeah.
so, on that note, I just want to kind of launch into some of the questions that have been percolating in my mind as we explore the first 10 chapters of this incredible storyline. And it is mind blowing to think that you've got another 16 chapters coming down the pike. So, without further ado, I'd just like to ask you, Zev, look, you're making a bold claim. You're making a claim that this was the largest criminal conspiracy in modern history. And what evidence in the first 10 chapters convinced you that this wasn't just parallel corruption, but a coordinated heist?
It's a really good question. Thank you for that incredibly nice introduction, Patrick. It's really terrific. And I know it's heartfelt and that makes it even better. But also, I should mention that your work on the con and others has dovetails with what I've been finding out for the greatest heist. So it's always great as an investigative journalist when you find someone else who's doing similar work, but from a different perspective and it all matches. Because whenever things match, well, it's more likely to be true if people are looking at the same thing from different perspectives. I'm so thankful that we discovered each other. For me, the whole thing crystallized around 1981, which is, I discovered that Adnan Khashoggi, who had been this incredible figure in the world at the time, he was this high flying arms trader. He had this yacht. He was like a James Bond character. And I discovered that he was connected to both Jeffrey Epstein and to Donald Trump at around the same time. And the likelihood of that, well, it's possible. Of course, New York's a very small place ultimately when you think about it. Rich and powerful people can bump into each other at the same time. But the more I explored the connections between Khashoggi and Trump and Khashoggi and Epstein, it became clear that they were basically being recruited by a network. Adnan Khashoggi, who was, the uncle of the slain Washington Post journalist. Adnan Khashoggi was part of a network that was involved in Iran-Contra, which takes you all the way back to, the reports around the post-Watergate reports that curtailed the CIA's ability to do black covert operations around the world. That's an aside story. But, then that was probably the moment it crystallized for me that, oh my gosh, these two people, Trump and Epstein, were recruited by the same network at around the same time. Now, the likelihood of that happening is pretty unusual. And it turns out that Trump was influenced by Khashoggi in the building of the Trump Tower and also in his very lavish penthouse, the Olympic Towers, I should say. That's where Khashoggi lived on the top floor. For a while, Donald Trump was also a resident there at the Olympic Towers. And just below them, in the old mansion attached to that, was the offices of the future Jeffrey Epstein and co offices. So not only were they co-located, they were also happened at the same amount of time, same period of time, but also connected to these extraordinary networks, which we'll find out later, turned out to be a giant criminal syndicate.
As a producer and someone who loves fiction and loves big blockbuster type of movies, when I was reading the first chapter, it was unfolding in a way that I was like, wait a second, this can't be real. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary how you pieced that together, but it was like, oh my God, it makes so much sense. So take us back to the beginnings of when you started pulling this thread. What was the first document or connection that made you realize Trump and Epstein's relationship was operational, not social?
It's a kind of a complicated question, it doesn't happen quickly. These kind of cultivations of operatives, of assets or whatever take a long time. In Trump's case, it took 12 years. And what happened, this is Craig Unger's work. He put out in his book, House of Trump, I think, in 1984, that David Bogatine, who was a connection to Semyon Mogilevich, the famed Russian mobster. Well, David Bogatine in 1984 walked into Trump Tower and spent $6 million in cash to buy 5 condos. Donald Trump was even there to see the suitcase of cash come in and made sure that the right amount was there. So then he could go and send it off to the bank. He offered Tina he offered his client, he's a lawyer, and limo ride to the bank so they could deposit the thing together. But that's the start of it. They started off by buying just condos in Donald Trump's towers. It again was influenced by Khashoggi. The Khashoggi had introduced at the Olympic Tower, which wasn't his thing, but he was a purchaser of it, that you could buy condos through LLCs. You didn't have to buy it the old-fashioned way. You could actually get a numbered company. And Trump liked that idea, and he adopted it for the Trump Tower. And David Bogatine was one of the first users of that LLC loophole, if you will. And that's how the Russian mob, under Semyon Mogilevich, had its first connection to Donald Trump. That name is so familiar now because he's a top 10 FBI most wanted person. But Mogilevich was also a business partner of Robert Maxwell. And when you put those two things together, that he was a business part of Robert Maxwell. We know Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. Well, he was a KGB spy. We pretty much know that. We know MI6 was another one that he was spied for. We know the Israelis are who he spied for as well. So the fact that you had as this name, Semyon Mogilevich, show up in both the histories of Trump and the Russian mob and the history of Robert Maxwell and the Russian mob, that to me was a big indicator that there was something much bigger here than just someone buying a condo or two.
And as you reveal the twisted mechanisms that would put all of those types of players in the same space is almost unbelievable. But yet, when you throw in money, power, and of course, what ultimately becomes the questions we're all asking at the moment, it starts to crystallize. And I wondered, when you've traced Epstein's transformation from math teacher to the financial operative that he became, who made that transformation possible? And what intelligence services show up in the evidence trail?
Well, this is so interesting. The case of Robert Maxwell's interest in Jeffrey Epstein is fascinating to me because Robert Maxwell was a world away from Jeffrey Epstein. He had no reason to really know Jeffrey Epstein. But Epstein got hired by a man named Douglas Leese, who was an MI6 operative. There was a period of time where Epstein disappeared out of America and went into Europe. And that's when he was working for this man named Douglas Leese. Douglas Leese was also working with Robert Maxwell on various sorts of arms trading. Leese is a well-known arms trader in the UK, connected to, amongst other people, Mark Thatcher, but also Prince Andrew. So it's interesting that at that point, it appeared like Epstein was working for an associate of Maxwell as Maxwell was doing the Iran-Contra arms deals, which Khashoggi was also involved with. And then I found out from Steve Hoffenberg, who was a business partner of Jeffrey Epstein, and that Maxwell had met Epstein in the 1980s, much earlier than previously anticipated, and that Epstein was learning how to be a international arms trader from Leese and from Maxwell, learning under the great minds, as it were, on how to do all this kind of stuff, the money laundering that it required and the hiding of money so they could be untraced when you bought all these arms. And that's how we get to the point where Robert Maxwell is changing the life of Jeffrey Epstein, but it was really done as well through Douglas Leese. And there's a great anecdote Ari Ben-Menashe told me about meeting Jeffrey Epstein in London in the early 80s. And he was introduced to Jeffrey Epstein by Robert Maxwell. And he was told by Robert Maxwell that he wanted Jeffrey Epstein to work with them on the Iran-Contra scandal, or the Iran-Contra arms smuggling, I should say. And that Ari Ben-Menashe said, no, I don't want that. I don't want him working with our team. But Robert Maxwell said, well, he's already been approved by the bosses, meaning that Robert Maxwell had gotten approval from the Israeli military intelligence, but I believe it's Israeli military intelligence, to hire Jeffrey Epstein at that time. So potentially we're looking at Jeffrey Epstein working for the Israelis from the early 80s.
Well, it really begs a lot of questions, to go a little bit drawing into the next question, though. But I am, you know, more curious than ever, given that statement, how we go from, the sorts of things that come out of the Dalton School, and then we go into, of course, Bear Stearns without business degree and everything that starts to shape up from there, which is
Yeah.
just peculiar to say the least, except for what you just said. You just said Maxwell said he had been proved by the brass.
Mhm.
Okay, who's the brass? So, for example, I'm just going to, ask this quick question. I'm not looking for an answer,
Yeah.
but I just happened to be reminded when he said that. I was watching Steve Miller on the, CNN yesterday when
Yeah.
he was going off about, I'm trying to, just basically pure power by the Trump
Oh, yeah, the
administration.
Insurrection Act and yada, yada.
Right.
Yes.
And then suddenly he stopped stone cold, right? I mean, it was the most, you and I are both
Plenary
in the
powers,
business.
yes.
Right, the
Yeah.
plenary powers,
Yeah.
and he stops cold turkey, and he's got, like, literally like a deer in the headlights. I'm wondering who's in his ear. I know it
Someone,
could be right? I'm
someone
wondering
was in
who's
his ear.
and that brings us, the idea the compromat operation is, central to the investigation. So how did they identify the targets, and what made the leverage they created so durable over the decade?
Maybe I should spend a little more time actually answering some of the questions because it is interesting that, he's a math teacher who's not very good at math, but who gets hired at the Dalton School. But then is introduced to Ace Greenberg and immediately hired by Ace Greenberg to go and work at Bear Stearns. Now, that is remarkable for any math teacher. That's not how it normally happens. But let's say in this case, Ace Greenberg was a champion of young minds that he liked. But who was also there at Bear Stearns at the same time as one of their biggest clients and a close friend of Ace Greenberg was Robert Maxwell. So, when you look at that connection, well, that's really interesting that he met Robert Maxwell probably, according to at least one letter in his 50th birthday book, that they met in as early as the 1970s, perhaps, well before he even got to work with him in the UK on these arms deals. And, that is an interesting thing to look at because he doesn't actually ever leave the Ace Greenberg orbit. Jeffrey Epstein stays in the Ace Greenberg orbit all the way through to 2008. And we'll get to that later on. But it's really interesting that he doesn't actually leave. And of course, the other person that was in the Ace Greenberg orbit was none other than President Donald Trump. Well, not then president, but then he was just Donald Trump. He was his broker and his number one call guy if he needed anything done with selling stocks or raising money. In fact, a lot of the money that was raised for the Trump casinos came out of Bear Stearns. So again, you got these three men. That's possible. It's coincidence. It's also more likely that it's not coincidence that these three men landed up connected to Bear Stearns and Ace Greenberg at around the same time.
Okay, it's not interesting. It's like nuclear brain emoji. Right?
Yeah.
Robert Maxwell is doing business with Ace Greenberg, legendary trader Ace Greenberg, and all of the other elements that will reveal themselves throughout this unbelievable work. But look, and Trump was a client at that time. It's just mind blowing because, when you think of Trump's financial vulnerabilities back in
Mhm.
the 80s and the 90s, they're well documented, of course. But how would those debts to foreign actors become actual operational control? Said another way, when does debt become conspiracy?
You know, it's interesting. During the 90s, and we'll talk about the blackmail in just a bit as well, but during the 90s, we all recall how many times Donald Trump was bankrupt. Every time I turned on the news way back then, it was like, oh, he's bankrupt again. And each time he was able to bounce back on his feet again. And it's just a stunning display of resilience against everything by becoming bankrupt. Of course, he wasn't really becoming bankrupt. He was staging bankruptcies because he figured out that he could extract money from his businesses by declaring bankruptcy and then restarting again. He'd be able to start a business, leverage it to the hilt, crash it into the ground, but having stolen some of the money, extracting some of the money. Your good friend William K. Black calls it control fraud. What happens is he did this over and over and over again. Now, the 96 one is particularly interesting. Trump visits Russia in 1987 for sort of a test run with Ivana, and they tour St. Petersburg, they tour Moscow, was supposedly for a hotel that they were trying to build, but it was basically the KGB putting them through the motions and trying to get some compromise on him, which I believe they did. But in 1996, he comes back there, having just finished bankrupting his casinos. He had three casinos fail in a row. He had no money. He was $100 million in debt. They couldn't even, they had monitors looking at how much money he spent every month for lunches. It was a very, very controlled bankruptcy that it was in. And yet he goes to Moscow with Leon Black and a couple of other sort of top-notch execs at the time. And he comes back almost completely whole. He's back with $450 million and also back on the Forbes 400 list. So you had a guy that was completely broke, completely devastated. And so who paid him that money? Well, you can assume that, he's in Russia. They're looking for assets. They've been looking at him since 1987, right? They've been monitoring his activities. In fact, our reporting put him at as early as 1983 that they'd started really monitoring Donald Trump. So between, that and 96, you got a period of time there where they really got to know who he was. And in many ways, including Ivana, by the way, was also a Czech informant through her father. But this is how he became owned by the Russians, how Trump became owned by Russia, is that they basically bailed him out of these bankruptcies when no one else would pay him any money, no one else would loan him any money. And he was like, well, I'm going to take this deal. I'm going to sell my soul to the devil. And he did. He sold to the devil. So when people say, what does Vladimir Putin or Russia have on Donald Trump? It's everything. They own him. It's lock, stock, and barrel, everything.
Yeah, Matt Taibbi, if you're listening, there's a lot more in your defense, I mean, that's one of the most mind-boggling scenarios of all. Of those of us in our profession have literally gone turnkey in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, talking about compromat. I mean, these guys are the best in the world, I suppose, obviously between the Russians and the Israelis and however that plays out with of course, all things Epstein. But look, you built this investigation on documents. You've got property records, you've
Mhm.
got flight logs, you've got sealed court filings and intelligence reports. What's the single most incriminating document that appears in the first 10 chapters?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the reality of it is when I discovered that Ghislaine and Jeffrey had become the heir apparents to Robert Maxwell's empire, and knowing from my sources that Jeffrey Epstein had been working with Robert Maxwell up until the day he died on sorting out all his debt and all his messes that he was in, although he was really stealing money. He was just stealing all the money. And and there's this famous story of after Robert Maxwell's death, Ghislaine is on the Lady Ghislaine, which is the boat that Robert Maxwell named after his daughter, and she's hurriedly telling the crew to shred a whole bunch of documents over, that she knew were critical documents. I'm told that some of those documents were Jeffrey Epstein related documents. They wanted no record of the fact that when they finally appeared in America in 91, which is the story they told everyone, that there would be any history connecting Epstein to anybody before that. Now, we could prove that that's not true now, but at the time, that was remarkable to me. So that's certainly, that came from Steve Hoffenberg. Steve Hoffenberg he's unfortunately passed away now, but before he died, he was a very good friend of Jeffrey Epstein for a period of time until he went to jail for 18 years for Epstein's crimes. He was convicted of a Ponzi scheme that Jeffrey Epstein really really did. I mean, he was a mastermind behind the scheme. But Hoffenberg went to jail for 18 years. He came out of jail sort of a reformed man, but I suspect he was also interested in having a little bit of vengeance on what happened to him. But he told me so many things about Epstein that really formed the spine of this particular story of the greatest heist. This stuff is not conjecture. It's from pieced together from people who knew Epstein really well, who was side by side with Epstein for 9 years. In Hoffenberg's case, in Ari Ben Menashe's case, he was the handler of Robert Maxwell. I mean, these are not incidental people. These are people who were in a position to know, and they knew what they were looking at as well.
What strikes me as obvious, but it bears at least some more introspection, is the
Yeah.
idea that the system failed repeatedly to stop this. Where did the protection come from? Who had the power to bury the warnings and shielded this operation for nearly 40 years?
I mean, obviously, the intelligence operations that back these guys up, I mean, Ari Ben Menashe told me in no uncertain terms, so did Hoffenberg, that Epstein worked for Israeli military intelligence. That's the same group that Ari Ben Menashe worked for. It's the same group that would fall under Ehud Barak, who was the defense minister in Israel at the time. All of that is just makes sense. Ehud Barak was connected to Jeffrey Epstein on a regular basis. So you know that the Israelis were heavily involved in running the Epstein operation. But they were also working with the Russians. They have a long history of connecting between the KGB and then successor agencies and the Israeli military intelligence and Mossad. They have a long history of connecting with each other, and they work together on various things. Now, in this case, the reason they're connected is because the mob, the Soviet, Russian, Israeli mob, is really what's driving all of these events. It's after when the refusing program happened in the 1980s, a lot of Jews in particular, but other people were allowed to leave the Soviet Union for the first time and move into the United States. That is when a lot of intelligence assets and a lot of mob figures found their way out of Soviet Union and into Brighton Beach. And you sort of know that that's where the start of this Israeli-Russian mob that we know today that is so powerful, that's when they sort of got their beginning in the United States. They rolled up the Italians after that, and then, they became quite powerful figures. And that's where we get to today. The connection between them and Epstein is obvious, and the connection between Trump and them is pretty obvious, and we can see that all the time through today. So that's where the protection comes from. Also from the CIA, I suspect. The CIA's role with Jeffrey Epstein, we just don't know about enough. I hope they come out at some point with their files, because clearly some of the money that they had put aside for Iran-Contra went to Robert Maxwell. It was never paid back. So my understanding is that Robert Maxwell probably absconded with that money before his death, which means that that money landed up going to Ghislaine and to Jeffrey probably. And so we don't know, we can't follow that money trail. It's, of course, as off the books as you can get. We talk about Iran-Contra money, but we know that it was never paid back. So I'm curious to know, there were various times when Epstein worked with the CIA on a number of things. We just don't have a lot of detail about that. And it's hard for me to speculate.
Wow. Brighton Beach, it kind of brought me full circle to what we started with, because I discovered you because of Lev Parnas, who, of
Yeah.
course, moved here from the Ukraine to Brighton Beach. And of course, you can tell, anyone can tell by talking to Lev and his story, that he kind of understood some things and he was involved with a lot of other things. So, look, so much more we could discuss. Are we nearing being out of time?
No, we got time. I got an hour here scheduled for this, so we can free flow or get questions from the audience. Or
Well, wonderful, because see, one of the most intriguing things about this moment, just given what you just laid out, been able to thread the needle, so to speak, but I'm left with wanting more introspection on some of the characters, which I'll come back to. But first and foremost, I just want to kind of talk about it as sort of an entry point that I think is relevant. Okay. So earlier today, I discovered online, that was released online, that the representatives Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, of course, of Kentucky, had written a letter directly to Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, asking questions about his understanding of how $1.5 billion had been managed during a time that JP Morgan Chase had suspicious activity reports that didn't come to light for over 10 years. That was said directly by two, congressmen trying to get to the bottom of this in the midst of everything else that's going on, right? So, and I hear you talk about this with your colleagues quite a bit, but I wonder if you could piece this together today, and then let's backfill how this works in terms of the greatest heist. So, here's the nation's largest financial institution that has a division for high net worth asset management, right? The idea, and I happen to work with the New York Times editor who just revealed this last week for the first time. And how long has this Epstein scandal been percolating that we don't have all of the answers to? And here, for the first time, was on the front page of the New York Times about a month ago from a fantastic writer by the name of David Enrich. David Enrich, as you probably are aware, happened to write the book called Shadow Towers, which is the
Dark
story of
Towers. Was it Dark
Dark
Towers?
Towers.
I love David.
Dark
He's
Towers.
terrific. Yeah, we know each other as well.
Yeah, my apologies. Dark Towers, which is what? Just
It's the history of Deutsche Bank, and it's so influential because it is actually the story a lot of Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, because they were both clients of Deutsche Bank after 2013, if I'm not mistaken. But it's interesting that, and he does a great job. People should really read it. I mean, considering it's the history of a bank, it's remarkably gripping. And it's just because the story is a page turner with so many murders and things that flow through there that makes your mind blow. But it was interesting that, he also wrote this thing about JP Morgan in the New York Times. And both Trump and Epstein were clients of JP Morgan up until 2013. So you've got, Enrich has very carefully crafted the piece, and that's now led here to this incredible letter, which I find, this letter that comes from Congress is not just a let's have some evidence letter. It reads like a indictment. I mean, it's not just please send us some documents. It is, what the hell were you doing for 15 years? It's hiding all this money for this human trafficking operation. And why was there so many close relationships between the people at JP Morgan and with Epstein? It just makes no sense that there was so much, after the fact, after we knew he was a sexual predator. Why was there so much contact, and why did they need him so much? And there's various answers to that question. But what I love about most of this letter and some of Enrich's work is that the very notion that there'd be 1.5 billion or whatever it is of transfers that went through JP Morgan for Jeffrey Epstein just suggests that he is something other than just your typical, bounty hunter, whatever he described himself as. This guy was working on an international level, moving money around for arms deals, for other business deals, and also definitely for human trafficking of these teenage girls, which they knew about. I mean, there's no doubt that JP Morgan didn't know about it. They basically facilitated all this human trafficking. And this guy, Jamie Dimon, who's also a big supporter of Donald Trump and his economic policies, surprise, surprise, is basically has for many years denied any knowledge of even knowing Epstein, which is ridiculous and is just ridiculous on the face of it. I mean, Jess Staley, who was a friend of Epstein's, was a big executive at JP Morgan, but also